Now, what's so odd about all of this is that when President Trump first was inaugurated, just less than a month after he was inaugurated, this was in February of 2025, he said exactly the opposite. He said he wanted to cut the defense budget. Here, the Washington Post, Trump administration orders the Pentagon to plan for sweeping budget cuts. Quote, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth has ordered senior leaders at the Pentagon and throughout the U.S. military to develop plans for cutting 8% from the defense budget in each of the next 5 years, according to a memo obtained by the Washington Post and officials familiar with the matter, a striking proposal certain to face internal resistance and strident bipartisan opposition. Now, why would that be? Why would an attempt to just reel in this defense budget by 8% generate such a massive outrage in Washington and strident bipartisan opposition? The answer is obvious. Both parties are funded by the military-industrial complex, by the arms industry, by the intelligence giants like Booz Allen Hamilton and Palantir, where the NSA and other intelligence agencies outsource their functions in the form of massively lucrative contracts, all fueled by the revolving door, where people who run these agencies go out of government and get massive contracts to work at those very agencies that they help make rich. And then at the start of a new administration, they go back into government. Recall that Joe Biden's choice for defense secretary, Lloyd Austin, came right from Raytheon. He was serving on the board of directors of Raytheon and then went right into the Pentagon, oversaw this massive increase in military budget, a lot of which went to Raytheon, company where he has stock, where he had served on the board of directors. That's, needless to say, everybody benefits except you. And you'll notice that when this is all happening, when Trump says, I want to have a $1 trillion defense budget, I want to have a $1.5 trillion defense budget, I want to bomb Yemen, and want to bomb Iran, and want to send all these money, these weapons to Ukraine, I want to send all this money to Ukraine, I want to send all this money to Israel, I want to give all these weapons to here, I want to bomb all these places, I want to have a 3-month military buildup in the Caribbean, off the coast of Venezuela, bomb Venezuelan boats, have a CIA destabilization campaign inside Venezuela. Nobody ever says, how are we paying for that? We're tens of trillions of dollars in debt. Nobody ever asks that. The minute, though, that you propose any kind of program that's designed to help the ordinary American in their mature lives deal with the effects of declining wages, deindustrialization, or the wreckage of the 2008 financial crisis, or free trade agreements, the minute you try and provide any kind of leg up or benefit to anyone that are American citizens, which is supposed to be the role of the government. I'm not talking about radical proposals. I'm talking about proposals that exist throughout the entire Western world, highly capitalist societies. Even though it's a tiny, tiny, minute fraction of these kind of things that we're spending on the Pentagon, that's when you start to hear, how are we going to pay for that? Who's going to pay for that? And what's so amazing is the Defense Department has failed an audit 7 times in a row, including last year. It's a basic audit. The auditors come and say, show us where this $900 billion went. And they can't. It disappears. They can't account for it. How could you possibly pour another $500 billion into an agency, into a world that can't even account for the money that they're getting? It's like sending more money to Kiev, even though you know that there's huge amounts being embezzled and skimmed and not accounted for. Now, this is all in contrast, and it's an interesting juxtaposition because it both happened today, to what happened in New York earlier today. So, as you undoubtedly know, the newly elected mayor of New York City, Zohran Mamdani, despite what you might have heard, did not run on a platform of introducing Sharia law into New York City. He didn't run on a platform of throwing gay people off of buildings or hanging them by cranes. He didn't get elected on a platform of murdering people inside synagogues. He was elected on a platform of affordability. As I showed you many times before, I saw the Mamdani campaign in its incipient stages when nobody thought he could win, including me. I mean, anyone who told you that they thought he was going to win is not telling the truth, but I could see it was a very potentially potent campaign, that he was charismatic. And most of what impressed me the most was, despite being a Democrat, he wasn't running around calling Trump a fascist or that sort of thing. He went to the neighborhoods in New York City where that had the biggest shifts in support from the Democrats to Trump in the 2024 election. He did this almost immediately after the 2024 election, the end of 2024, the beginning of 2025. And he went on these streets, and these were mostly non-white neighborhoods, working class neighborhoods, a lot of immigrant neighborhoods. And he asked people, who did you vote for? And they would say Trump, and he would say why. And he listened. He didn't actor or argue. He just listened. And their arguments were, I'm sick of spending all this money on foreign governments. I'm sick of the unfairness that all these people who are here illegally get these benefits that we don't, while we have to work 2 and 3 jobs. But most of all, they said, we can't afford our lives. And they, of course, blamed Joe Biden for that. They wanted a change. That's what happens. And affordability was the main issue. It took various forms of grievance, but that was the primary issue. And he then constructed his campaign. I watched him do it around the things that he heard in like very impressively pragmatic ways. And I think one of the best campaign commercials I ever saw was when he went and talked to street vendors in New York who sell hot dogs or pizza. And if you know New York City, I lived there for almost 15 years. This is a staple of New York City life. You're in a huge rush, trying to get a cab. You're hungry. You don't have time to go to a restaurant. You just grab some food at a street vendor. It's ubiquitous. And he highlighted how the bureaucracy in New York City is so extreme that people who apply for street vendor licenses have to wait 4, 5, 6 years just to get a license. And as a result, there are all these other people who own licenses and they rent them for exorbitant sums. And that means street vendors have to pay $15,000, $20,000 a year just to get a license to be a street vendor, to sell hot dogs or other forms of ethnic food, which is all over New York City, every different kind. And obviously that gets passed on to the consumer. And that was one of his commercials. Why is this food $10? It should be $7. That's the kind of campaign that he ran. And one of the things that is most plaguing people, not just New York City, but throughout the United States, is how expensive daycare is. Now, when I grew up, in the 80s, the 70s and 80s, daycare wasn't a big issue because oftentimes most kids were raised by 2 parents, at least in middle class, working class neighborhoods, where one parent worked and the other parent, typically the mother, stayed at home and took care of the kids. So when the kids were 1 and 2 and 3, you didn't need daycare. You had one parent, the father, working outside of the house, typically the father, the mother staying at home and taking care of the children. That's really not possible anymore for huge numbers of people for so many reasons. Lots of single mothers, the father abandons them or divorces and leaves the responsibility to raise the kids with the mother. But even when you have 2 parents, and you're living in New York City, both parents have to work. Most couples don't have the option of staying at home anymore and taking care of kids, which means you need to do something with your young kids. And that typically means putting them in daycare. And it's very expensive to put people in daycare. So if you're working 2 jobs and you're struggling to pay daycare, which is an absolute necessity, then raises the question, how are you going to pay your rent? How are you going to pay food? How are you going to get health care? These are the struggles that most people are dealing with. And one of Mamdani's pledges was, let's not do something super radical, like go back to the Soviet Union under Stalin in the 1940s and see what he did. It's like, let's look at France and Canada and Australia and Spain, all of which provide highly affordable and subsidized or even free daycare. And that's what people voted for. You don't have to agree with it. You don't have to like those kind of policies, but that's what people in New York City voted for. And in order to do that in New York, it's very complicated, but you need the support of the governor to fund it. Governor Kathy Hochul is pretty much a moderate kind of Democrat, not at all a populist, but she's running for re-election. She sees which way the winds are blowing. That's why she endorsed Mamdani, even though ideologically she would never have done so. She announced she was going to fund that program today. Here from the New York Times, Governor Hochul and Mayor Mamdani announced a plan to make New York City childcare universal. Quote, on Thursday, Governor Kathy Hochul and Mayor Zohran Mamdani stood together to announce a plan that would initially expand childcare options for nearly 100,000 young children, putting the mayor on a path toward realizing the most ambitious and costly promise of his campaign and handing him a significant political victory barely a week into his term. In proposing to spend $4.5 billion on childcare in the upcoming fiscal year, Ms. Hochul underscored how the lack of affordable childcare has transformed from a back burner policy debate into an urgent political concern, Advocates have estimated that about 50,000 children would enroll in the program once it is fully built out. Now, you can look at that and say, $4.5 billion. That's a huge amount of money. Where are we going to get that from? In the scheme of what President Trump just did, took a $1 trillion military budget where there's massive waste and fraud, to put it mildly, and wants to increase it by 500 billion more, none of which improves the material lives of American citizens for the most part. And you set that up, and no one says, where's that money coming from? How are we getting another $500 billion? But you take a proposal that isn't trivial, but certainly isn't bank breaking in the scheme of what the U.S. government spends. It has a direct benefit on the lives of working class people, on poor people, the people that Donald Trump's campaign said he wanted to, whose lives he said he wanted to benefit and help. And you see this like indignation, like it's communist rule that has happened. And I'd be more sympathetic to the question where that money is coming from if that same question was asked about all our wars that are obviously wars of choice, like removing Maduro, bombing boats off the coast of Venezuela that have no impact, none, on the availability of drugs inside the United States, certainly not fentanyl, which is by far the most deadly drug that doesn't come from Venezuela. These are wars of choice, bombing the Houthis in Yemen, bombing Iran, threatening Iran again, as President Trump just did, that we're locked and loaded and ready if you don't treat your protesters better. Kind of ironic. Nobody ever says where we're getting that money from, or to send it to Ukraine or send it to Israel. But you do something like this that actually benefits the lives of people, not give them a huge handout, just enables them to have daycare for their young kids while they work. And the reaction is, though, this kind of massive socialist burden has set in. Here is Zohran Mamdani during his inauguration talking about what he ran on and what he intends to do.
The cost of childcare will no longer discourage young adults from starting a family, because we will deliver universal childcare for the many by taxing the wealthiest few. Those in rent-stabilized homes will no longer dread the latest rent hike, because we will freeze the rent. Getting on a bus without worrying about a fare hike or whether you'll be able to get to your destination on time will no longer be deemed a small miracle, because we will make those buses fast and free.
No, you don't have to agree with all those policies, as I said, but they were democratically ratified. I hear that all the time. Someone complains about President Trump's immigration policy or trade policy. People say, rightly, he ran on that. That's what Americans voted for, and he has a mandate for it. Same with him, with Mamdani. Here's one of the reasons why this resonates. Here's from the Sboro Institute in February 2024 on the extremely onerous cost of living for people who live in New York City. Quote, a New York City family would have to make more than $300,000 a year to meet the federal standard for affordability, which recommends that childcare take up no more than 7% of total household income to pay for just one young child's care. Put another way, 80% of families in the city, 80% of families in the city cannot afford care for even a single child based on this standard. We obviously all have an interest in having young children taken care of properly, and of making sure that people who are working can do things like pay their rent and get health care for their kids. But again, they're libertarians. I know in my audience who don't like these kind of programs. That's totally fine. I simply am trying to juxtapose how relatively little this cost is that actually does improve the material lives of people, whether you agree with it or not. You think this is the right way to do it. And the indignation is intense compared to the vastly greater sums that are poured into our military that have nothing to do with defending the United States. Here in the New York Times, September of 2023, how soaring childcare costs are crushing New Yorkers. Quote, as the city's affordability crisis worsens for nearly everyone, even upper middle class New Yorkers are struggling to pay for childcare. The workers who provide it are struggling too. Now, you would have thought that Joseph Stalin himself was reincarnated and that all private property was seized in New York City. If you looked at the reaction today from conservatives to this sort of policy on the very same day that Trump announced an obscene 50% increase in the military budget to $1.5 trillion number that's hard even to say and take seriously. Here's one major MAGA account, January 8th, 2026. I am meme, therefore I am. Breaking: New York City socialist mayor Mamdani rolls out a multi-billion-dollar, quote, free childcare plan for kids under 5 across New York State with a special focus on, quote, home-based providers. Here's Laura Ingraham, the Fox host, a friend of mine, who I agree with sometimes and not always, quoting this very kind of pro-Israel MAGA account and wokeness. And he said, quote, Governor Hochul, quote, New York child care spending for this year will be expanded to $4.5 billion. And she, above it, wrote, good luck, New York. Here's Tom Fitton of Judicial Watch. New communist politician wants government-run daycare for babies. Here's Vince Logman. New York will be bankrupt in 5 years. The Patriot Oasis, another MAGA account, breaking Governor of New York, Kathy Hochul announces that the state will expand, quote, childcare spending in the state to $4.5 billion. Smells like fraud. Cat Turd, who's an absurd figure. Here comes more massive Democratic fraud. Here's Nick Shirley, the MAGA influencer who was celebrated for his investigative journalism in Minnesota, who essentially is now saying that Zohran's plan will promote Somali-style fraud, meaning that investigation is now being exploited to suggest that any kind of attempt to provide childcare for Americans is inherently fraudulent. Now, there's all sorts of valid reasons to be concerned with fraud in government programs. I was just talking about the insane levels of fraud in the Pentagon budget. And the solution there is to increase it, apparently, by 50%, even though the government can't even pass an audit. And there have been investigations into fraud well before this viral video. But here are the amounts that we're talking about. U.S. Attorney's Office, District of Minnesota, March of 2025. A federal jury finds feeding our future mastermind and co-defendant guilty in a $250 million pandemic fraud scheme. Military Times, December 19, 2025. Just by contrast, Pentagon fails a financial audit for 8th year in a row. Quote, the department has received a failing grade on every audit since Congress mandated annual reviews. Beginning in 2018, it is only one of the government's 24 major agencies never to pass. I do think it's time to ask what the priorities are of the United States government. Donald Trump's campaign was predicated on the fundamental claim, which I agree with, that bipartisan policies in Washington over the past 20, 30, 40 years have been about everything other than bringing prosperity and a thriving future to Americans' families, the American middle class, the working class, the American poor, what Donald Trump called the forgotten men and women. Seems to me like enabling your kids to be taken care of while you have to go to work without bankrupting you is an advancement of the interests of the American people. By massive amounts of other spending that is never questioned, particularly in the Pentagon, wars, giving money to fuel foreign wars. And that's what I think needs to be reassessed. If you're angry because there's hundreds of millions of dollars in fraud in Minnesota and think that a $4.5 billion program to provide the same kind of benefits to American citizens as Western Europeans, Central Europeans, Australians, Canadians, people throughout the developed world enjoy, that's some kind of grave socialist plot that will bankrupt America, where are we going to get that money from? Ask that question to the vastly more abusive and wasteful graft and revolving door enrichment that is a massively bigger transfer of wealth from the American taxpayer to the coffers of these gigantic corporations and the arms industry and the intelligence world and the surveillance world, enriching Palantir. than anything else like fraud in Minnesota with daycare programs, or a program that Mamdani ran on and people voted for. That's the democratic process. If you ever find yourself asking questions, how are we paying for that? Where's that coming from? And you're not asking that question about always increasing and exploding military spending and wars and financing of foreign wars, that I think is what needs a radical and rapid reassessment. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.